There are centuries we remember for their art, their discoveries, their soaring cathedrals and luminous ideas. And then there are centuries we remember because the ground itself seemed to drink. When we talk about history's most violent centuries, we are not talking about a single kind of killing. Violence has worn many faces: the clash of armies on open fields, the slow starvation behind city walls, the quiet murder of a people by law, by forced labor, by disease carried across oceans, by the stripping away of land and language until a culture becomes a rumor. Sometimes violence arrives like thunder. Sometimes it settles like dust and stays for generations. To name a most violent century is to enter an uncomfortable realm: counting. Historians count bodies when they can. They count tax registers, parish burials, military rolls, ruined villages, empty houses, missing names in censuses. They compare grain prices and weather diaries, and they read letters in which a witness describes a road lined with corpses and the smell of unburied death. They argue, revise, and argue again. Numbers shift as archives open, as methods improve, as propaganda is peeled away. But across all that uncertainty, certain eras rise unmistakably, periods when war, state collapse, ideology, and technology combined into engines that could devour millions. Violence is not just an eruption. It has origins. It gathers like pressure in the deep earth, through inequality, ambition, religious certainty, imperial hunger, or fear. It is fed by administrative innovation, the ability to tax more efficiently, to raise larger armies, to transport men and guns farther, faster. It is fed by stories. A society tells itself that enemies are less than human, that suffering is sacred, that conquest is destiny, that security requires preemptive cruelty. And it is always shaped by chance. A harvest that fails, a king who dies without an heir, a new weapon that breaks an old balance, a disease that leaps from one species to another and suddenly makes the world feel cursed. Imagine standing at the edge of a medieval field after battle. The air is metallic with blood and damp earth. Flies cloud in black drifts. A man searches for his brother by the shape of his boots because faces are gone. Now imagine a modern city after an air raid, glass powdered into the streets, the buildings opened like anatomy, smoke turning daylight into a sickly dusk. Between those scenes lies not a simple evolution, but a grim escalation, not a straight line, but a widening capacity. Yet the story we're about to travel through is not only a story of cruelty, it is also a story of people trying, sometimes desperately, sometimes imperfectly, to contain it. After every age of slaughter, human beings have built rules, myths, institutions, memorials. They have tried to name what happened and swear it will not happen again. Those vows are part of the record too, and their failures are among history's most haunting echoes. The centuries that follow are not separate rooms with locked doors. They bleed into one another. A war ends and its veterans carry trauma home. A famine passes and a generation grows up smaller, weaker, more bitter. A conquest reshapes trade routes reshape empires, empires reshape the logic of killing. Across time, violence migrates, it adapts. So we begin in an age when the world's rhythms were still measured largely by the seasons and the strength of human muscles, when most people lived close to the edge of hunger, and when the collapse of a harvest could be as lethal as the collapse of a kingdom. We begin in a century that felt, to those living through it, like an apocalypse arriving in chapters. First the cold, then the hunger, then the war, and then, like a dark wind, plague. In the early 1400s, before the worst had fully arrived, Europe was already straining. The medieval climate that had helped agriculture expand in earlier centuries was shifting. Seasons grew less predictable. Rains came at the wrong times. Winters bit harder. In villages, people could feel it in the thinness of their stores and the anxious way they measured the sky. Then came years that broke the pattern of life. From 1315 onward, in much of northern Europe, the rains did not stop. Fields turned to mud. Grain sprouted in the ear or rotted on the stalk. hay spoiled, cattle starved, and when animals weakened, they were vulnerable to disease. People slaughtered livestock early, flooding markets with meat for a moment, and then facing the winter with nothing left. Hunger changes a society's chemistry. It makes the future shrink. It turns neighbors into competitors. It drives migration, theft, violence born of desperation. Chroniclers describe people eating roots, bark, grass. They describe parents abandoning children and children wandering into towns with the vacant stare of the starving. In the worst accounts, taboo collapses. Cannibalism appears at the edges, not as a sensational myth, but as the final failure of a world's moral architecture. When famine loosens the body, it also loosens the grip of immunity. It sets the stage for a killer that does not negotiate. In the 1340s, a disease moved along trade routes and sea lanes from the east. It arrived at ports and then traveled inland, faster than any rumor could keep pace. People called it the Great Mortality. We call it the Black Death, though the black was not a single symptom so much as the darkening of the imagination itself. The plague struck with an intimacy that made it terrifying. Swollen lymph nodes, the buboes, rose like cruel fruit in the groin, the armpit, the neck. Fever turned minds to delirium, skin mottled, breath failed. Sometimes death came within days, bodies piled in houses. Priests died administering last rites. Gravediggers died digging. The social rituals that made death bearable, funerals, wakes, final prayers, fractured under the speed of catastrophe. This was not only a demographic disaster, it was a collapse of meaning. In a world where God was the anchor, people demanded an explanation. Was it punishment? Was it the end? Movements of penitence wandered from town to town, flagellating themselves in public, trying to whip sin out of the body politic. Fear looked for scapegoats. In many places, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells or conspiring with the devil, and pogroms followed, massacres carried out by people who believed they were defending themselves against an invisible killer. Meanwhile, across the Channel and deep into the heart of France, another engine of violence was turning, older than plague, and in some ways more familiar: war. The 100 Years' War was not a single uninterrupted conflict, but a long series of campaigns and truces, raids and sieges, born from dynastic claims and national pride that had not yet fully solidified into the modern idea of nationhood. Armies were smaller than those of later centuries, but their impact could be enormous because they moved through agrarian landscapes like locusts. They lived off the land. They took grain and livestock. They burned villages to deny resources to the enemy. They created refugees who carried hunger and disease with them. The very shape of medieval war made civilians vulnerable. Sieges were common, and sieges were slow strangulations. A walled town could resist a larger force, so attackers starved it. Inside, people rationed until the line between living and dying blurred. Outside, mercenaries waited, their patience sharpened by pay and plunder. When a city finally fell, it could be spared. If a ransom was paid, if terms were agreed, or it could be sacked, a controlled descent into chaos where murder, rape, and looting were part of the wage. And then there were the chevauchés, fast-mounted raids intended to terrorize and devastate. The goal was not always to win territory, but to break the enemy's economy and morale, to show peasants that their lord could not protect them. A landscape could be ruined not in a decade, but in a season. In 1346, at Crécy, English longbowmen helped shred a French cavalry assault, demonstrating the power of disciplined missile fire against aristocratic shock tactics. In 1356, at Poitiers, the French king was captured. These were not just battles. They were humiliations that destabilized political systems built on honor and hierarchy. The war's violence was amplified by disorder. When truces came, soldiers were not always disbanded. Bands of mercenaries, the free companies, roamed, extorting towns, seizing castles, turning the countryside into a marketplace of fear. In such an atmosphere, a farmer's life could be undone by forces as abstract as royal succession and as immediate as a hungry man with a knife. Beyond Western Europe, other brutal dramas unfolded in the same century, reminding us that violence is never contained by one geography. In the Eurasian steppe, the Mongol Empire that had once thundered across continents fragmented into khanates, still powerful, still capable of devastating campaigns, but increasingly pulled into regional struggles. Trade routes that connected East and West also carried conflict and, crucially, carried pathogens. The same arteries that moved silk and spice moved plague. Further south and east, the rise of Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, cast a long shadow at the century's end. He built an empire through relentless military conquest, and his campaigns were marked by spectacular terror. Cities that resisted could be annihilated. Chroniclers describe pyramids of skulls erected as warnings. Whether every detail is exact or exaggerated, the pattern is unmistakable. Violence used as theater, cruelty as strategy, massacre as message. What makes the 14th century feel uniquely violent is not only the body count, staggering as it was. It is the layering. Famine weakens a population. Plague tears through it. War breaks what remains of stability. Persecution turns communities against their neighbors. Violence becomes not a single event but an atmosphere. And yet, in the aftermath, the world did not end. It changed. Labor became scarce. Survivors demanded higher wages. Lords tried to clamp down, to freeze the social order, and that effort sparked unrest, peasant revolts that would flare in different regions. The authority of institutions, including the church, was shaken by its inability to shield people from catastrophe. Art and literature darkened and deepened. A new consciousness of death emerged. The dance macabre, the skeleton leading the living in a grim procession. When death is everywhere, it becomes an obsession, and sometimes a strange teacher. As you move through this story, if you find yourself drawn into these long arcs of cause and consequence, consider staying with the journey. A quiet way to support these explorations, if you feel inclined, is to like the film and subscribe, not as a transaction, but as a signal that careful, slow history still matters in a fast world. Because the centuries ahead will not grow gentler. They will grow more connected. And connection, as the plague demonstrated, can be a conduit for catastrophe. Trade and exploration will widen the world and widen the scale of violence with it. The 15th and 16th centuries are often remembered for Renaissance light, for paintings that gave depth to space, for new maps, for ships pushing into unknown seas. But the same forces that expanded horizons also expanded the reach of organized killing. When European sailors crossed the Atlantic and returned, they carried more than silver and stories. They carried microbes that had evolved alongside dense populations and domesticated animals, pathogens to which Europeans had some degree of exposure and to which the peoples of the Americas had little or none. Disease does not need intent to be violent. It does not need ideology. It needs only contact. The first great wave of devastation in the Americas was not a battle, it was a biological invasion. Smallpox, measles, influenza, names that had long stalked the old world, moved through communities that had never met them. Villages emptied, leaders died. Social knowledge, how to plant, how to govern, how to mourn, fractured as elders vanished. Whole regions were destabilized before European armies even arrived in force. Then came conquest in the strict sense. Men with steel and horses, with alliances and betrayals, with cannons that sounded like the end of the world to those hearing them for the first time. In 1519, Hernán Cortés marched toward Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire, a city of causeways and shimmering water, of markets alive with color, of temples rising above canals. He did not conquer alone. He exploited existing resentments among peoples subjugated by Aztec tribute demands. He turned political fractures into military advantage. Violence here was not merely Spaniard against indigenous. it was also indigenous against indigenous, woven into the logic of empire. The siege and fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was a catastrophe layered like the 14th centuries. Warfare, starvation, and disease merged. The city, once a marvel, became a place of corpses and collapsing infrastructure. When it fell, it was not only a regime that fell, but a cosmology, a way of ordering time and divinity and power. A decade later, Francisco Pizarro's seizure of the Inca Emperor Atahualpa unfolded like a parable of shock. A small band of Spaniards captured a ruler at a meeting arranged under the pretense of diplomacy. They held him for ransom, rooms filled with gold and silver. Atahualpa was executed anyway. The message to the Andes was unmistakable. Old rules did not apply, but conquest is never just a moment of seizure. It is what follows, the slow violence of extraction. In the mines of Potosi, high in the Andes, men labored in brutal conditions to pull silver from the earth. Systems of forced labor, drawing on and distorting existing indigenous obligations, fed imperial wealth. Communities were drained of working-age men. Disease and exhaustion did what swords could not. The silver flowed across oceans, and with it flowed inflation, new wars, new markets, and new forms of exploitation. Alongside this extraction grew the Atlantic slave trade, an atrocity whose full horror emerged over centuries. African men, women, and children were captured through raids and wars that European demand intensified, sold in coastal forts, packed into ships in conditions designed for profit rather than life. The Middle Passage was a floating tomb. Those who survived were sold into plantations where violence was routine, legalized, and justified by racial ideology that would harden over time. This was not the sudden violence of a battlefield. It was violence as a business model. Meanwhile, in Europe and the Mediterranean, the 16th century ignited with a different kind of conflict, religious war. The Protestant Reformation fractured Western Christianity. What began as theological dispute became political earthquake. Princes chose sides, cities split, families split. In a world where salvation was not a private question, but a communal order, heresy was not merely wrong, it was dangerous. Rulers feared that religious dissent would unravel obedience itself. In France, the wars of religion brought massacres and cycles of vengeance. The Saint Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572 remains one of the era's darkest symbols, a targeted killing of Huguenot leaders that spiraled into broader slaughter. Streets ran with blood, not because violence was accidental, but because fear and zeal convinced ordinary people that killing neighbors was a form of purification. In the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire and European powers struggled for dominance. Navies clashed, most famously at Lepanto in 1571, where oared galleys collided in a battle that was both tactical and symbolic. Christianity against Islam in the rhetoric of the age, though the reality was always more complex, shaped by alliances, commerce, and imperial ambition. The Ottoman-Safavid rivalry in the east, Sunni against Shia, empire against empire, added another layer. Here too, religious identity was tied to state power. Borders were not just lines on a map, they were fault lines of belief, and belief could be weaponized. The 16th century, then, was violent not because humanity suddenly became crueler, but because the world became more entangled. Distant regions were connected by ships. Economies became linked by bullion and enslaved labor. Ideologies became tied to state survival. When connection grows, the consequences of conflict multiply. And in the shadow of that growing connection, Europe was learning new lessons about war, how to fund it, how to organize it, how to discipline it. The military revolution, some historians describe, changes in fortification, firearms, and bureaucracy, was not only a technical shift, it was an institutional one. States began to build the capacity to wage longer wars, to sustain standing forces, to tax populations more efficiently. The apparatus that could protect could also devour. The 17th century would inherit all of this: religious fracture, imperial rivalry, administrative growth, global trade. It would take those ingredients, and in several regions at once, ignite them into conflagrations so intense that they still feel like cautionary tales written in ash. If the 14th century felt like apocalypse in chapters, the 17th can feel, looking back, like apocalypse in parallel. Across Eurasia, climates cooled in what is often called the Little Ice Age. Winters grew harsher, harvests failed more often, grain prices spiked. Hunger returned as a recurring undertone, pushing communities toward unrest and pushing rulers toward desperation. In fragile societies, weather can be political dynamite. In Central Europe, the fuse caught in 1618 in a city that had seen empires rise and fall: Prague. A confrontation over religious rights and imperial authority culminated in an act that became instantly symbolic. Officials defenestrated, thrown from a castle window. It was theater, but it was also declaration. The 30 Years' War had begun. At first, it resembled the kind of conflict Europe had already seen, a struggle between Protestant and Catholic forces within the Holy Roman Empire, but it rapidly widened. Foreign powers intervened. Dynastic ambition blended with confession. Armies grew larger. Campaigns stretched longer. What might have been a contained blaze became a continent-wide fire. The 30 Years' War's most lethal feature was not any single battle. It was the way war unmade the conditions of life. Armies moved across German lands again and again, requisitioning food, seizing livestock, stripping villages. When they could not pay soldiers, they paid them with permission to plunder. Disease followed troops like a shadow. Typhus, dysentery, plague, each found opportunities in crowded camps and weakened populations. Civilians fled, carrying what they could, often finding only other armies, other ruined towns. Some regions lost a staggering portion of their people. The exact numbers are debated, but the devastation is not. Entire villages vanished from records. Fields went untilled, then overgrown. Wolves returned to places where human presence had thinned. The war became a kind of slow-motion collapse, where violence was inflicted not only by swords and muskets, but by hunger and exposure and despair. There were moments of horror that burned themselves into memory. The sack of Magdeburg in 1631 stands as one of the war's infamous atrocities. A city stormed, looted, and consumed by fire, its population slaughtered in chaotic brutality. Such events were not anomalies. They were the extreme end of a spectrum in which civilians were always, in some measure, the battlefield. And yet the war was also a contest of statecraft. Sweden intervened under Gustavus Adolphus, a king who combined religious cause with strategic interest. France, Catholic yet wary of Habsburg power, supported Protestant forces, revealing a harsh truth: ideology matters, but so does balance of power. In this century, reason of state could outweigh confession, and that shift would shape the modern world. When the Peace of Westphalia arrived in 1648, it did not end war as a human activity, but it did formalize a new international logic: sovereignty, territorial integrity, a system in which states recognized one another's right to exist. It was a framework built from exhaustion, a map drawn over graves. While Central Europe bled, the British Isles convulsed in their own civil wars. Conflict between monarchy and parliament, between different visions of church and authority, erupted into battles that pitted neighbor against neighbor. The execution of King Charles I in 1649 was a shockwave, an assertion that even a monarch could be judged, condemned, killed. It opened questions that would echo for centuries. Who holds power and by what right? Those questions, when answered with certainty, can justify immense violence. To the east, the 17th century brought cataclysmic transformation in China. The Ming dynasty, strained by fiscal problems, corruption, environmental stress, and rebellions, collapsed. The transition to king rule was not a gentle SMYNR of regimes. It was a prolonged period of warfare, rebellion, and repression. Cities changed hands. Mass killings occurred. Loyalty and betrayal became matters of survival. Here too, climate and economy intertwined with politics, and the result was devastating. In the steppes and borderlands, conflicts between expanding states and nomadic peoples reshaped regions. In the Ottoman Empire, long wars and internal strife created instability. Across the world, trade expanded even as societies fractured, as if the globe were tightening its connections while tearing at its seams. What makes the 17th century so haunting is its simultaneity. Multiple large-scale conflicts, each with their own causes, overlapped in time. This convergence suggests something unsettling, that violence is not always local. Sometimes it is systemic, emerging when many societies face similar pressures: climate stress, fiscal strain, religious polarization, and evolving military capacity. And in that evolving capacity lies a clue to what comes next. The 17th century did not invent modern war, but it helped teach states how to sustain it, how to tax, how to borrow, how to build administrative machinery that could mobilize resources. Those innovations could create stability, but they could also create the ability to kill at scale. If you've stayed with this story so far, you're already doing something rare, allowing complexity to unfold instead of demanding a quick moral. If you'd like to keep traveling through these centuries with us, you might choose to like the documentary and subscribe, not as applause, but as a small commitment to long memory. Because the 18th century, so often painted with Enlightenment light, will show us another truth: that reason and refinement can coexist with empire, slavery, and global war, and that civilization has never been a reliable shield against brutality. Step into an 18th century salon in Paris, and you might hear talk of reason, rights, the social contract. Candles flicker against gilded mirrors. Philosophers argue about the nature of tyranny. Across the Channel, pamphlets circulate about liberty and representation. In coffee houses, men debate trade, science, and the limits of monarchy. Now step outside those rooms and listen for the other sounds of the century: the crack of a whip on a plantation, the roar of cannon from a ship of the line, the muffled cries from a fortress under siege in a colonial war fought far from Europe's polite rhetoric. The 18th century was not among the single deadliest by raw percentage in many regions, but it is essential in the story of violence because it globalized great power war and deepened systems of exploitation. It refined the machinery. Europe's states grew increasingly adept at financing conflict. Banking and credit expanded. Governments borrowed against future tax revenue. War became, in a grim sense, sustainable, less dependent on a single charismatic ruler and more on institutional capacity. This sustainability meant wars could be larger, longer, and fought on multiple continents. Consider the War of the Spanish Succession at the century's start, a struggle triggered by a dynastic crisis, but fueled by European powers' fear of imbalance. Armies marched across fields that had been marched across before, and civilians endured requisitions and sieges that felt like inherited curses. The war ended with treaties, with borders adjusted, with claims recognized or denied, but the deeper pattern remained. The lives of ordinary people were bargaining chips in elite negotiations. Mid-century, the 7 Years' War erupted, and in many ways it was a prototype for modern world war. Britain and France fought not only in Europe, but in North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India. Indigenous nations were drawn into the conflict, sometimes allied with European powers for strategic reasons, sometimes crushed between them. Forts changed hands, villages burned. Soldiers died by musket and bayonet, and also, always, by disease. In North America, battles like Quebec in 1759 carried consequences far beyond the moment. An empire's language, law, and culture could be displaced not by gradual assimilation, but by a single military campaign backed by naval supremacy. The reshaping of territories meant the reshaping of lives. Land claims, migration patterns, the fate of indigenous diplomacy. In India, the decline of Mughal central authority and the rise of the British East India Company revealed a terrifying hybrid of commerce and conquest. The company was not a nation-state in the classic sense. It was a profit-driven enterprise with its own army. It could wage war, extract revenue, and manipulate local politics to secure advantage. Violence here was often bureaucratic, tax policy that caused ruin, military campaigns that enforced compliance. The line between trade and rule blurred until it vanished. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic world, the plantation economy expanded, powered by enslaved labor. Sugar islands in the Caribbean became some of the most profitable and most brutal places on Earth. Mortality was high. Work was relentless. Punishment was designed to deter rebellion through terror. The enslaved resisted in countless ways: sabotage, escape, revolt, the preservation of culture under conditions meant to erase it. But the system endured because it was woven into global markets. The sweetness in European teacups was linked directly to suffering under tropical suns. And yet, within the Enlightenment's language lay seeds that would later explode. If human beings possess rights, what of those held in chains? If government rests on consent, what of colonies ruled without it? These questions were not abstract. They were dangerous. By the century's end, the American Revolution would challenge imperial authority, and the French Revolution would go further, declaring a new order and then, in its struggle to survive, unleashing violence of its own. The 18th century thus becomes a bridge between dynastic wars and ideological wars, between older empires and newer forms of mass mobilization. It is tempting to imagine progress as a steady ascent, more knowledge, less cruelty. But history is rarely that tidy. The 18th century shows how easily civilized societies can normalize brutality when it is profitable, distant, or disguised as necessity. It shows how a language of universal rights can coexist with systems that deny humanity to millions. And as the century turns, that contradiction will erupt. The next era will bring crowds in the streets, the fall of kings, and wars fought not only for territory, but for the right to define reality itself. Wars in which the state will demand everything, including the bodies of its citizens. The age of revolution is coming. In 1789, Paris was a city of stone and smoke, of narrow streets where rumors moved faster than carts. The smell of bread, when there was bread, was a kind of comfort, and its absence a kind of menace. For years, France had carried the weight of debt from wars and court extravagance, but what people felt in their bones was simpler. Food was expensive, wages were thin, and the old order seemed to demand everything while offering little in return. When the Estates General convened, it was meant to be a pressure valve. Instead, it became the match. Revolution begins, often, as a language. It begins with words that feel clean and bright: liberty, equality, the people, the nation. Those words have power precisely because they seem obvious, because once spoken aloud, it becomes hard to justify their denial. But language can also become a weapon. Words can divide the world into the pure and the corrupt, the virtuous and the traitor. In such a world, compromise starts to look like betrayal. When crowds moved toward the Bastille, they were not storming a fortress purely for strategic value. They were storming a symbol. The fall of that prison did not instantly liberate the country, but it shattered the aura of invincibility surrounding monarchy and aristocracy. In the months that followed, fear spread through the countryside, the great fear, driven by rumors of aristocratic plots, of bands coming to burn crops, of punishment descending on villages that dared to dream. Peasants attacked manor houses, burned records of feudal obligations, tore up the paper chains that had bound them for generations. And then the revolution began to demand more than reform. It began to demand a new kind of human being. The king was brought to Paris. The court's distance, both physical and psychological, collapsed. The revolution's leaders debated constitutions, rights, the structure of the state. Outside, bread lines and political clubs shaped the mood. The revolution became a performance, a daily drama played in streets and pamphlets. The guillotine, initially framed as a humane instrument, swift, equal, not the slow torture of older executions, became the most famous machine of the age, an emblem of a terrible idea, that virtue could be enforced by steel. When war came, it accelerated everything. European monarchies watched France's upheaval with alarm. France, in turn, saw foreign armies as proof that the revolution would be strangled in its cradle if it did not fight back. War militarized politics. It flooded the government with emergency powers. It encouraged suspicion of enemies within. The revolution's most violent phase, the terror, did not come from chaos alone. It came from administration. Committees, tribunals, denunciations, paperwork that could end a life. In a climate of fear, accusation became a form of power. To be suspected was to be in danger. To be publicly enthusiastic was a kind of armor. The revolution devoured its own children. Leaders who had once seemed indispensable were branded as traitors and sent to the blade. When the crowd cheered executions, they were cheering not only death, but the reassurance that the revolution still had control over the forces it had unleashed. Yet even amid that brutality, something else was happening: the birth of mass politics. The idea that a nation could mobilize its citizens not as subjects but as participants, soldiers, voters, patriots, was intoxicating. The levée en masse called men to fight not for a king but for a people. This was a revolutionary transformation of war. Armies grew larger, the stakes grew higher. If the nation itself was sacred, then enemies were not merely rivals, they were threats to existence. Out of this furnace rose a figure who understood the New World's logic better than most: Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a soldier shaped by meritocratic opportunity and the ruthless clarity of battlefield necessity. His genius was not only tactical, it was political. He could speak the revolution's language while rebuilding a centralized state. He could promise order without openly resurrecting the old regime. He could make people believe that stability and glory were the natural reward for years of chaos. Napoleon's wars spanned Europe like a storm system. They were wars of movement, of artillery, of conscription. They devastated some regions and reorganized others. They spread revolutionary principles, law codes, the end of certain feudal privileges, even as they imposed French dominance. In Spain, the invasion ignited a bitter guerrilla war, a word that entered global vocabulary because the violence was intimate and relentless. Ambushes, reprisals, villages punished for resistance, civilians trapped between imperial armies and insurgent fighters. In Russia, Napoleon's march to Moscow became a nightmare of distance and climate. The burning of the city, the retreat through snow and hunger, the collapsing columns of men. This was not merely a military defeat, but a demonstration of how nature itself could become an ally in war's arithmetic. The Napoleonic era's violence was enormous, but its deeper legacy lay in what it taught the modern state. It taught that a government could demand the lives of its citizens on a mass scale and frame that demand as patriotic duty. It taught that war could be sustained through bureaucracy, logistics, and ideology. It taught that victory could reshape not only borders, but the interior architecture of societies. When Napoleon fell, Europe's rulers gathered at Vienna to stitch the continent back into balance. They spoke of legitimacy, of stability, of restoring what had been broken. But they could not restore innocence. They could not unteach the idea that people could overthrow a king. They could not erase the memory of mass mobilization. They could not return war to its older, limited forms. And if you're still with me here, moving through this long chain of causes and consequences, you might take a quiet moment, when it feels right, to like the documentary and subscribe. Not because it changes the past, but because it helps keep these deeper, slower stories alive in a world that often rushes past them. Because the 19th century, the century that follows, will build on everything we've seen so far. It will industrialize war. it will expand empire. And it will produce, in places far from Europe's grand congresses, death tolls so vast that they still struggle to fit inside the human imagination. The 19th century is often filmed in sepia, top hats and steam trains, gas lamps and iron bridges. It is the century of factories and telegraphs, of cities swelling into modernity. It is remembered for progress, the harnessing of energy, the acceleration of life. But progress has a shadow, and in this century the shadow lengthened across the globe. Industrialization changed violence in subtle ways before it changed it in spectacular ones. It created new wealth and new hunger for resources. It created new technologies and new ways to move men and weapons. It created urban working classes packed into tight quarters, where unrest could spread quickly and where governments learned to fear crowds as much as foreign armies. But the 19th century's most devastating violence did not always occur in the places most commonly framed as modern. Some of the largest death tolls came from civil wars and uprisings in vast empires strained by demographic pressure, economic disruption, and the collision between old authority and new forces. In China, the Taiping Rebellion erupted in the mid-century like a continental earthquake. Its leader, Hong Xiuquan, fused personal revelation with a radical vision of society, claiming a divine mandate that challenged the Qing dynasty's legitimacy. What began as rebellion became a sprawling civil war, with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, cities besieged, provinces fractured into competing regimes. The fighting was brutal, but the greater killer, as so often in history, was the unmaking of ordinary life. Famine, disease, displacement. Fields became battlefields, granaries burned, refugees flooded into cities that could not feed them. The scale of death was staggering, not because life was valued less, but because the machinery of survival collapsed across an enormous population. This pattern repeated in different forms across the century. The Indian subcontinent, under expanding British rule, experienced famines whose lethality was intensified by economic policy and the integration of local agriculture into global markets. When drought came, the safety nets were often insufficient, and decisions made in administrative offices could determine whether millions lived or died. Hunger here was not always the simple absence of food. Sometimes it was food being exported or prices being driven beyond reach, while people weakened in sight of full warehouses. Violence can be an act. It can also be an arrangement. Meanwhile, European empires spread across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The rhetoric was civilization, progress, order. The reality often involved conquest, forced labor, land seizure, and the reshaping of societies to feed imperial economies. In some places, resistance was met with massacres intended to demonstrate dominance. In others, colonial rule's violence was quieter but pervasive. Taxes that compelled men into mines or plantations, legal systems that stripped communities of autonomy, borders drawn with rulers' pens that cut through languages and histories. Even within Europe, the century carried blood. Revolutions in 1848 surged and failed across the continent, leaving behind both repression and the stubborn persistence of nationalist dreams. Nationalism was a powerful new religion. It could unify, and it could exclude. It taught people to imagine the nation as a family, and then taught them to see outsiders, minorities, and dissenters as infections. Across the Atlantic, the American Civil War revealed what industrial capacity could do when aimed inward. Railroads moved troops. Factories produced rifles in quantity. Telegraphs transmitted orders with unprecedented speed. Battles like Antietam and Gettysburg produced casualty lists that stunned contemporaries. The war's violence was not only in combat, but in the transformation of society. Emancipation, the collapse of an economic order built on slavery, and the bitter aftershocks of Reconstruction and backlash. Here, too, ideology, what a nation was and who counted as human within it, was inseparable from killing. In Europe, The Franco-Prussian War at the century's end hinted at the future. Rapid mobilization, decisive battles, the siege of Paris, and the political upheaval that followed all foreshadowed the 20th century's coming storms. The unification of Germany shifted the balance of power. Industrial strength translated into military potential. National pride hardened into rivalry. By 1900, the world was more connected than ever. Steamships and railways stitched continents. Telegraph lines carried news and panic. Financial markets linked fortunes across oceans. And empires, immense, confident, brittle, stood like towering structures on foundations of grievance. The 19th century's violence is sometimes harder to see because it is scattered across colonies, across famines, across civil wars that Western narratives once treated as peripheral. But if you widen the lens, the century becomes a preparatory chamber for something even larger. A world in which technology, ideology, and mass mobilization would converge to produce slaughter on a scale that would redefine the meaning of the word. The fuse was laid. It only needed a spark. In 1914, Europe's capitals still carried an illusion of control. Diplomats spoke of alliances as if they were safety nets rather than tripwires. Generals spoke of timetables as if war were a schedule rather than a living catastrophe. Many believed that if conflict came, it would be swift, decisive battles, a quick settlement, a return to normal. Then the trains started moving. Mobilization itself became an irreversible force. Millions of men were gathered, equipped, and sent toward borders like rivers redirected by human hands. Once the machinery began, stopping it seemed impossible. States feared that hesitation would be fatal. War became a logic trap. The opening months shattered illusions. When armies collided, they discovered that industrial weapons, machine guns, rapid-fire artillery, favored defense and slaughtered offense. Men marched into curtains of fire and fell in heaps. Attempts to break through produced trenches. Long wounds cut into the earth, stretching across landscapes that became moonscapes of mud and shattered trees. Life in the trenches was a new kind of suffering. It was not the heroic clash of banners imagined in earlier wars. It was endurance in filth. The stink of latrines, the sweet-sour rot of corpses in no man's land, the constant gnaw of lice. The terror was not only the moment of attack, but the waiting, the whine of shells approaching, the knowledge that a random piece of metal could end you without warning, the psychological erosion of living under perpetual threat. Soldiers wrote home about rain that never seemed to dry, about rats fattened on the dead, about nights when the sky turned white with flares and the ground shook like an angry animal. The Great War expanded beyond Europe. Colonies were drawn in. Battles were fought in Africa and the Middle East. In the Ottoman Empire, wartime paranoia and nationalist ideology turned on the Armenian population with catastrophic consequences. Deportations, massacres, death marches, an entire people targeted under the justification of security and suspicion. Here, violence was both chaotic and bureaucratic. Orders issued, convoys forced along roads, survival made nearly impossible by design. As the war dragged on, states demanded more. Economies were reorganized. Civilians were pulled into war production. Food was rationed. Propaganda flooded newspapers and posters, shaping enemies into monsters and sacrifice into sacred duty. When entire societies mobilize, war seeps into every household, every meal, every conversation. New weapons intensified the horror. Poison gas drifted across battlefields, searing lungs and eyes, turning breath into agony. Tanks rolled forward like crude mechanical beasts, trying to break the stalemate. Airplanes, still primitive, introduced the unsettling idea that death could fall from the sky. And then came the war's final cruelty, the pandemic that followed close behind it. Influenza swept across a world already weakened by malnutrition and mass movement, killing millions. Once again, as in the 14th century, disease layered itself onto violence, turning battlefields and hospitals into amplifiers. When the war ended in 1918, it did not end cleanly. Empires collapsed. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires all fractured. Borders were redrawn. New states were born into uncertainty. Millions of soldiers returned home, carrying injuries visible and invisible. In Germany, resentment festered. In Russia, revolution had already erupted, and civil war followed, another vast conflict with its own waves of terror, famine, and displacement. The peace treaties attempted to impose order, but peace made of punishment can be unstable. Reparations, territorial losses, and humiliation became political fuel. The idea of self-determination inspired hope, but the reality of mixed populations and contested lands ensured that many communities found themselves trapped between national projects. Minority groups became convenient scapegoats. Old grievances gained new flags. If you find yourself needing a moment to breathe here, you're not alone. The early 20th century can feel like a corridor where every door opens onto another tragedy, but staying with it matters. If you'd like to keep following these deeper arcs, how one catastrophe seeds another, you could gently support the work by liking the documentary and subscribing. It's a small act, but it helps keep thoughtful history in circulation, because what comes next is not a relief. The war that was supposed to end wars instead became a prologue. Out of the rubble of empires and the bitterness of peace, new ideologies would rise, promising certainty, purity, and redemption. And those promises would demand blood. The 1920s in some cities glittered. Jazz spilled out of clubs. Stock markets rose. Modern art fractured old forms into daring new shapes. It would be easy to believe from those bright windows that the world was healing. But beneath the surface, the ground was unstable. In the countryside of Eastern Europe, borders had shifted like tectonic plates. Veterans returned to farms that had been ravaged. Families tried to rebuild under governments that were often young, fragile, and suspicious. In the Soviet Union, the revolution had won, but victory did not bring peace. Civil war and famine had already scarred the land, and the new state sought to remake society at a terrifying speed. The drive for rapid industrialization and collectivization turned agriculture into a battlefield of policy. Grain was requisitioned. Peasants resisted. The state responded with coercion, deportations, and repression. Hunger returned not simply as weather's cruelty, but as political catastrophe, an immense human toll amid a struggle over control, ideology, and the extraction of resources to fuel industrial ambition. Violence here was frequently administrative. Quotas, confiscations, the branding of entire categories of people as enemies. Meanwhile, in Italy, a different solution to post-war chaos emerged. Fascism. It promised order, national revival, the end of humiliation. It offered belonging in exchange for obedience. Its spectacle, marches, uniforms, salutes, was designed to make individuals feel swallowed into something larger, something unstoppable. In Germany, the trauma of defeat, economic turmoil, and political instability created fertile soil for an even more lethal variant. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, it was as if the world's financial bloodstream seized. Unemployment spread like a fever. Desperation made radical answers seem plausible. In such moments, people often reach for narratives that simplify pain into blame. They look for villains. They look for groups to exclude. They look for leaders who speak in certainty rather than nuance. Nazism fused nationalism with racial ideology, turning prejudice into a comprehensive worldview and then into a state project. It promised not just political change, but biological renewal. It taught millions to see some neighbors as contaminants. And it built a system that could transform that vision into policy. Laws that stripped rights, propaganda that normalized hatred, organizations that trained youth to think in categories of purity and threat. Elsewhere, Japan pursued empire with increasing aggression, driven by a mixture of resource hunger, militarist ideology, and a belief in destiny. In China, internal fragmentation and external invasion created a landscape of immense suffering. Civilians were trapped between armies, between political factions, between survival and starvation. In Spain, civil war erupted in 1936, a conflict that became a rehearsal for wider catastrophe. It drew in foreign powers. It showcased ideological extremes. It featured atrocities, executions, reprisals, and the deliberate targeting of civilians. It also introduced, with chilling clarity, the terror of modern aerial bombardment. When bombs fell on towns, when civilians became targets, the future arrived early. What binds these interwar crises together is not simply the presence of violence, but the transformation of the state's relationship to the individual. Totalitarian systems, whether clothed in fascist or communist rhetoric, sought to penetrate life itself. They demanded not just obedience but belief. They blurred the line between political disagreement and existential threat. In such systems, repression is not an unfortunate side effect. It is a structural necessity, because terror maintains unity, and unity is portrayed as survival. By the late 1930s, the world stood again on the edge. Appeasement and diplomacy tried to hold back the tide, but the tide was made of ideology, rearmament, and a willingness to gamble with millions of lives. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the machinery began moving again. Trains, timetables, mobilizations. But this time, the coming war would not be fought merely for borders. It would be fought for visions of humanity itself. And the 20th century, the century that would become, in many measures, history's most violent, was about to open its darkest chamber. When the Second World War begins, it does not begin everywhere at once. It begins in fragments that only later snap into a single, monstrous shape. Japan's long war in China, Italy's imperial campaigns, Germany's steady dismantling of treaties and norms. By the time the world finally admits that a global war has arrived, the rhythm of escalation is already set, like a drumbeat no one can stop hearing. In September 1939, German forces strike Poland with a speed and coordination that seems to belong to a new era. Tanks, aircraft, mechanized infantry, movement as a weapon. Cities are bombed. Roads clogged with refugees carrying bedding and children and whatever can be tied to a cart. The shock is not only military, it is psychological. The modern state has learned how to move violence at the speed of engines. And Poland is not simply conquered, it is dismembered, carved by German and Soviet powers under their pact. In the seams of that partition begins a pattern that will define the war's true horror, the deliberate assault on civil society. Teachers, priests, officers, intellectuals, those who might organize resistance, are targeted. The point is not merely to win territory. The point is to break a people's spine. Across occupied Europe, daily life becomes a negotiation with fear. Signs appear in languages not your own. Curfews shape nights. Food becomes ration cards and rumors of black markets. Men disappear after a knock at the door. Resistance grows, and with it grows reprisal. Hostages shot, villages burned, families punished for a single act of defiance. War becomes intimate again, like it had been in earlier centuries, but now it is intimate with paperwork, lists, quotas, orders typed in offices. In 1940, France falls with stunning speed. The shock ripples across the world. For Britain, standing alone for a time, survival becomes a matter of air and steel. The Battle of Britain is fought above fields and rooftops, with pilots who are often barely older than boys. The bombing of cities, London, Coventry, turns nights into a kind of modern siege, where civilians listen for sirens and feel their houses tremble under impact. The home front becomes a front. Children are evacuated. People sleep in subway stations. The sky itself feels hostile. Yet even in this early phase, the war is already drifting towards something darker than conquest. Nazi ideology does not treat war as a clash of states alone. It treats war as a tool for racial transformation. It imagines Europe reordered by cleansing, by enslavement, by extermination. What is planned is not merely victory, but a new moral universe in which empathy is treason. In June 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union, opening the Eastern Front, the war's most colossal arena of death. The invasion is framed not as a conventional campaign, but as a crusade. Orders are issued that strip Soviet soldiers and civilians of basic protections. Commissars are to be executed. Slavic populations are to be reduced and exploited. Jews are to be eliminated. Hunger is weaponized. Plans are made to seize food for German use and let millions starve. The Eastern Front is a place where the scale of violence feels geological. Armies collide across immense distances. Entire cities are encircled. In Leningrad, a siege lasts so long that hunger becomes a season, then a year, then a nightmare that reshapes the definition of endurance. People boil wallpaper paste, they eat pets, they drag bodies through snow because burial becomes too difficult. Yet the city holds, and the holding becomes its own kind of defiance, one measured in frostbite and ration crumbs. In the West, the war has one shape. In the East, it has another. Here, captivity is often a death sentence. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war die from starvation, exposure, and deliberate neglect. Whole villages are cleared in anti-partisan operations that blur the line between combat and massacre. Partisans strike from forests. Occupying forces respond with terror meant to drain the sea in which resistance swims. The result is a landscape where cruelty becomes routine, where survival depends on hiding, bribing, betraying, or running, always running. And within this inferno, a targeted annihilation unfolds with terrifying precision. At first, the murder of Europe's Jews is carried out through shootings, mobile killing units following the army, rounding up communities, marching them to ravines and pits. The victims are forced to undress, to stand at the edge, to listen to the gunfire ahead of them. The killers drink, joke, harden themselves. The earth becomes a blanket for bodies. Places like Baba Yar become names that sound like echoes rather than locations, because the human mind resists picturing what happened there. But shooting is messy. It requires proximity. It strains even those trained to kill. And so the system evolves toward an industrial solution. Camps designed not for detention alone, but for extermination. Deportations begin, trains packed with families, luggage labeled, people told they are being resettled. The deception is part of the mechanism because it keeps the machinery moving smoothly. In the camps, the language of administration masks murder, selection, processing, special treatment. Victims are separated, those deemed fit for labor and those sent directly to death. Gas chambers turn murder into an enclosed procedure. Crematoria attempt to erase evidence in smoke. The numbers become almost impossible to hold in the mind, but the reality is not abstract. It is the sound of doors sealed, the panic, the clawing, the silence afterward. It is the smell that clings to hair and clothing and memory. This is not violence as collateral damage. It is violence as purpose. The Holocaust stands as a singular crime, not because other atrocities are insignificant, but because it represents a modern state mobilizing its resources, transport, bureaucracy, industry, propaganda, toward the deliberate extermination of an entire people, alongside the murder of other targeted groups. It is a warning etched into history that efficiency is morally neutral and that modernity can sharpen evil as easily as it sharpens medicine or art. On the other side of the world, the war's brutality takes different forms but no less devastating ones. In China, suffering has already been profound for years. Japanese occupation is marked by terror, forced labor, and atrocities that scar communities. Cities are bombed. Rural populations are displaced. Famine and violence interlock. The war in Asia is not a single campaign. It is a prolonged grinding that consumes civilians in vast numbers. In the Pacific, island battles become savage in their own way. Dense jungles, heat, disease, and fighting that often ends at close range. Soldiers learn to fear not only bullets but insects, rot, thirst. On some islands, caves become fortresses. On others, the sea itself is lethal. Civilians caught between armies face impossible choices. The wars reach turns even remote places into killing grounds. By 1944, the Allies push back from multiple directions. In the West, the D-Day landings open a path into France. The liberation of Paris is celebrated, but liberation is never pure joy when it arrives through ruins and graves. In the East, the Red Army drives westward with an anger forged in annihilation. It liberates camps and cities and also commits its own atrocities in the wake of its advance. War, by this stage, has stripped away any simple moral geometry. It has become a storm made of human beings. As the Reich collapses, the camps are uncovered. Emaciated survivors stare with eyes too large for their faces. Piles of bodies reveal the scale of the crime without needing words. The liberators, hardened by combat, are still shocked into silence. Photographs are taken because reality is unbelievable even to those standing inside it. And then, in August 1945, the war ends in a flash that changes the species' relationship to itself. Atomic bombs fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In an instant, tens of thousands die. In the days and weeks after, more die from burns, radiation sickness, injuries that cannot be treated in a shattered city. Shadows are burned onto walls. The air itself becomes a source of death. The war's final punctuation is not a battle, but a demonstration that human beings now possess the ability to erase cities in seconds. When the guns fall silent, the world does not exhale into peace. It exhales into grief, into displacement, into the daunting task of rebuilding amid trauma. Europe is a continent of ruins and refugees. Asia is scarred by occupation and civil war. The moral shock of the Holocaust forces new language. Genocide, crimes against humanity. Trials attempt to establish accountability, to declare that following orders is not a shield. The United Nations is formed with hopes as fragile as paper, but hopes nonetheless. If you've stayed through this chapter, through the war's darkest corridors, and you want to keep walking with this documentary as it follows violence into the post-war world, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe. Not as a sales pitch, just as a quiet way of saying that the past deserves more than slogans and that remembering is still a form of responsibility. Because the end of the Second World War is not the end of mass violence. In some places, it is the opening of new wounds. Empires will fracture. Borders will be drawn in haste. Ideologies will harden into blocks. And the world, armed now with nuclear fire, will enter a cold war that is anything but cold for those caught in its proxy flames. The photographs of 1945 show jubilant crowds in some streets, dancing, kissing, waving flags. They show soldiers returning home, thin and dazed. They show ruined cities being cleared of rubble, brick by brick. They also show something less cinematic, but just as defining. Columns of displaced people, moving on foot with bundles and blankets, a human tide pushed by collapsed borders and broken states. Peace does not arrive evenly. It arrives like weather, clear in one place, storming in another. In Eastern Europe, the war's end brings the consolidation of Soviet influence. Governments are reshaped, parties are purged, police states grow. Collaboration is punished, sometimes justly, sometimes opportunistically. In the chaos of revenge and reordering, old grudges find new uniforms. Ethnic Germans are expelled from regions where their families had lived for generations, forced westward in brutal conditions. Some have been complicit in Nazi crimes. Others are simply caught in the logic of collective guilt. The moral problem is agonizing. How to respond to a monstrous occupation without becoming monstrous in response. In the Soviet Union itself, repression continues under a state that has survived invasion at unimaginable cost and now insists on control as a form of security. Wartime trauma, paranoia, and the machinery of surveillance feed renewed purges. People disappear into labor camps. Whole populations are deported on suspicion of disloyalty. The lesson the state teaches is stark. Survival belongs to those who do not stand out. Meanwhile, in the east, Japan's surrender does not settle China. Civil war resumes, and the struggle between nationalist and communist forces produces further devastation. In Korea, liberation from Japanese rule becomes division under great power rivalry. A line is drawn that will harden into a border, and families are split by politics they did not choose. But perhaps no post-war violence captures the tragedy of sudden freedom more than partition. In 1947, British India is divided into two new states, India and Pakistan. The decision is made with breathtaking speed, under immense political pressure, amid communal tensions that have been intensified by years of policy, propaganda, and fear. Borders are drawn on maps by people who have never walked the villages they divide. On paper, it looks like administrative necessity. On the ground, it becomes a catastrophe. As partition is announced, millions move, Hindus and Sikhs toward India, Muslims toward Pakistan, one of the largest migrations in human history. Trains become symbols again, as they were in Europe, but now they carry civilians fleeing with everything they can carry. And along the routes, violence erupts. Massacres, abductions, rape used as a weapon of communal humiliation, entire neighborhoods wiped out. The speed of the migration overwhelms any ability to protect people. Rumor becomes gasoline. Leaders plead for calm, but the crowd's psychology can be stronger than any speech when fear tells you that your neighbors will kill you first. The violence of partition is not just in death counts. It is in the shattering of coexistence, in the way people who had shared markets and festivals find themselves reframed as existential threats. It is in the stolen children, the families who spend decades searching, the silence in survivors who cannot speak about what they saw. It is in the way a border, once drawn, becomes an inheritance of suspicion. In the Middle East, the wars end, and Europe's reckoning with the Holocaust reshape global politics. The creation of Israel in 1948 becomes a watershed, an answer for many Jews to centuries of persecution and the genocide that had nearly destroyed European Jewry, a catastrophe for many Palestinians involving displacement and the loss of homes and land. War follows. Refugees emerge. Narratives harden. Here, too, violence is braided with identity, memory, and competing claims to justice. And as European empires weaken, anti-colonial struggles intensify. For colonized peoples, the rhetoric of freedom that had been used against fascism now feels like a promise that must be redeemed. Yet empires rarely dissolve politely. In places like Indochina, Algeria, Kenya, and elsewhere, independence movements meet repression, and repression feeds insurgency. Torture, executions, massacres, and guerrilla warfare become recurring patterns. The battle is not only over territory, but over legitimacy, who has the right to rule, and who is called a terrorist versus a freedom fighter. Across this post-war landscape runs a new kind of tension, the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, emerging as rival superpowers, organize the world into spheres of influence. Both claim moral superiority. Both fear encirclement. Both fund allies, overthrow governments, conduct covert operations, and justify violence as necessary to prevent the other side's expansion. Ideology becomes geopolitics, and geopolitics becomes local tragedy. In Greece, civil war burns. In Iran, Guatemala, Congo, Vietnam, and countless other places, the Cold War's logic turns domestic conflicts into international battlegrounds. Sometimes the violence is direct. Often it is mediated through weapons, training, and money. The phrase proxy war can sound clinical, but for those living through it, there is nothing proxy about death. The 20th century's violence by now has a rhythm that feels almost cruelly familiar. A system collapses or is challenged. Power responds with force. Resistance escalates. Civilians pay the price. What changes after 1945 is the global awareness of that pattern and the simultaneous inability to stop it. The world now has institutions dedicated to peace, and yet it also has nuclear weapons that make great power war unthinkable, while leaving smaller wars to proliferate. And so the story moves forward into the later 20th century, when ideology and decolonization and ethnic nationalism will collide again and again, sometimes in spectacular wars, sometimes in concentrated bursts of genocide, and sometimes in slow-motion catastrophes that unfold under the world's distracted gaze. There is a bitter irony to the late 20th century. It is the age when the world becomes more capable of witnessing violence than ever before, and yet it remains painfully capable of failing to prevent it. Television brings war into living rooms. Photographs travel fast. International law develops new language and new courts. Humanitarian organizations expand. And still, in certain places, the old darkest patterns return. Neighbors turned into enemies, states weaponizing identity, bureaucracies organizing death. In Cambodia, during the 1970s, the Khmer Rouge attempt to remake society from the ground up. Cities are emptied. People are marched into the countryside. Education becomes suspect. Professionals are targeted. Families are broken apart. The ideology is radical purification, to erase the old world so completely that only the new can exist. Hunger becomes policy. Forced labor becomes normal. Torture becomes routine. Killing becomes, in some areas, administrative. The killing fields are not a metaphor. They are literal places where bodies accumulate because the regime decides certain categories of people must vanish. What makes such violence possible is not only fanaticism at the top, it is the way fear spreads downward. When survival depends on demonstrating loyalty, denunciation becomes currency. People kill or cooperate because refusal might mean their own death. Responsibility becomes morally tangled, and yet the outcome remains clear: a society hollowed by terror. In the Soviet sphere and beyond, the Cold War continues to turn internal conflicts into accelerants. In Latin America, military dictatorships and insurgencies produce disappearances, torture, death squads, forms of violence designed not merely to eliminate opponents, but to terrify entire populations into silence. Mothers march with photographs of missing children. Families live with a particular kind of grief, the grief of not knowing, of waiting at the door for someone who will never return. In Afghanistan, invasion and resistance ignite a long war that will ripple into the next century. In Iran and Iraq, war consumes hundreds of thousands, with trenches and chemical weapons and human wave assaults, a grim echo of earlier industrial slaughter. In Lebanon, civil war fractures society into militias and sieges. In each case, global politics intersects with local history, and civilians become the terrain on which power is contested. Then, in the 1990s, as the Cold War ends and many imagine a peace dividend, Europe is reminded, again, that modernity does not immunize a continent against atrocity. In the former Yugoslavia, nationalist rhetoric hardens into violence. Multi-ethnic communities fracture under propaganda and fear. Ethnic cleansing enters common speech, a phrase as chilling as it is revealing, because it disguises what it describes. People are expelled at gunpoint. Women are raped as a strategy of humiliation and terror. Camps appear again in Europe, not as extermination factories on the Holocaust scale, but as places where human beings are confined, beaten, starved, and killed under the logic of identity war. Mass graves are dug. Towns that had lived together for decades turn into killing zones with astonishing speed. And then Rwanda. In 1994, in just about 100 days, an enormous number of people are murdered, mostly Tutsi, along with moderate Hutu and others, through a campaign of incitement, organization, and mass participation. The weapons are often intimate: machetes, clubs, rifles. Roadblocks appear, lists circulate. Radio broadcasts inflame hatred, turning a population into a killing force by telling them that the victims are not neighbors but threats, insects, enemies. The speed is part of the horror. It is not a slow drift into violence, it is a plunge. The world watches fragments of it. Reports emerge. Debates happen in international halls. Words are weighed, whether to call it genocide, whether to intervene, whether intervention is possible. Meanwhile, people die in churches where they sought sanctuary. Families are hunted in fields. The aftermath is a landscape of trauma, so deep it feels geological. These late-century atrocities force a hard question. Why do the same patterns repeat even after the world has sworn never again? Part of the answer lies in how violence is enabled. It does not require a majority of sadists. It requires institutions that cooperate, media that incites, leaders who benefit from fear, and enough ordinary people convinced that killing is safer than mercy. It requires the collapse of trust. Once trust collapses, the most frightening thing about violence is how quickly it can become normal, how quickly the extraordinary becomes routine, the unthinkable becomes policy. And if you've stayed with these chapters, if you've chosen to sit with history's most difficult truths rather than look away, you might consider liking the documentary and subscribing. Not because it fixes anything by itself, but because attention is a kind of moral resource, and the stories that receive attention are the ones less easily erased. Because the final stretch of this journey is not only about recounting catastrophe. It's about stepping back and seeing what these violent centuries reveal about power, technology, ideology, and the fragile human effort to build restraint. And it's about asking, with as much honesty as we can manage, what it means to remember. When we call certain centuries most violent, we attempted to make a grim podium, first place, second place, third. But violence is not a sport, and suffering does not line up neatly for comparison. 1 million dead in a famine do not die the same way as 1 million dead in a campaign of extermination. 10,000 murdered in a village can be, for that village, an apocalypse that contains the whole universe. Still, comparison matters because it reveals patterns. In earlier centuries, much of the killing came from the collapse of life support systems. Famine, disease, wars, disruption of planting and trade. The violence was often indirect, though no less real. In the modern era, especially the 20th century, states gained the ability to kill directly and deliberately at scale, with bureaucratic coordination. That shift changes the moral landscape. It forces us to confront not only human cruelty, but human organization. Technology is part of that story, but it is never the whole story. A rifle does not choose a target. A gas chamber does not build itself. Technology becomes deadly when paired with ideology, fear, and institutional compliance. The 20th century's most terrifying lesson may be that ordinary administrative tools, forms, trains, censuses, quotas, can become instruments of mass death when a regime decides certain lives are disposable. And yet, the modern era also produces an unusual counterforce, a global conscience trying to become law. After the world absorbed the full horror of the Second World War, it attempted to build guardrails. The concept of universal human rights gained momentum. The Genocide Convention sought to define and prohibit a crime that had always existed in practice, but not in international legal language. The Geneva Conventions expanded protections for civilians and prisoners. War crimes tribunals tried to establish that leaders could be held accountable. These efforts are not meaningless. They create standards that can shame, restrain, or punish. They provide language for victims to name what was done to them. They offer tools for activists and diplomats to argue that sovereignty is not a license to murder. But the guardrails have always been fragile because power resists restraint. Great powers often apply principles selectively. Interventions are debated through lenses of interest as much as ethics. The international system remains, at its core, a system of states that can choose to cooperate or choose not to. There is another counterforce, too, one that feels almost paradoxical: nuclear weapons. The atomic bomb's existence does not make the world safer in any simple moral sense. It introduces the possibility of annihilation. It creates a permanent background hum of existential risk. But it also reshapes great power behavior by making direct war between nuclear-armed states catastrophically dangerous. In that sense, the bomb functions like a terrible taboo, one enforced not by morality, but by fear of mutual destruction. The result is a world where the most powerful states often avoid direct conflict, while smaller conflicts multiply: civil wars, insurgencies, proxy battles, wars that remain limited, only in the sense that they do not end civilization, even as they can end entire communities. This is the modern contradiction: unprecedented capacity for destruction paired with unprecedented efforts, however imperfect, to limit it. And in the background of every violent century lies another quiet engine: memory. Societies remember selectively. They build monuments to some dead and not to others. They teach certain narratives in schools and bury others in silence. Denial becomes a second violence, a way of killing the truth after the body has already been killed. In some places, memory is weaponized. Past atrocities are invoked to justify new ones. Grief becomes grievance. Grievance becomes identity. Identity becomes a justification for preemptive cruelty. This is one of the most dangerous loops in human history: the transformation of remembrance into permission. So what, then, is the point of walking through centuries like these? It is not to wallow. It is not to conclude that humanity is doomed. The record contains horror, yes, but it also contains resistance. People hiding neighbors, smuggling food into ghettos, refusing to denounce, documenting crimes at immense personal risk, building institutions, negotiating ceasefires, feeding strangers, rebuilding cities. Raising children after everything. Violence is not inevitable in the way gravity is inevitable. It is chosen, enabled, organized, tolerated, and sometimes stopped. The question is always, by whom and how? As we move toward the end of this documentary, we begin to see a kind of shape. The most violent centuries are not those with the most inherently vicious people. They are those where pressures converge: economic stress, ideological certainty, political collapse, technological capacity, and where institutions fail or are captured by extremists. They are those where the boundaries of us shrink until them can be killed without remorse. The haunting truth is that these conditions are not relics. They are possibilities that can re-emerge whenever fear becomes profitable, whenever leaders gain power by dividing, whenever people decide that safety requires someone else's disappearance. And that brings us to the last chapter we can't avoid, the one that is still unfinished because it includes us. The 21st century begins under the shadow of the 20th. The ruins are not only physical, they are psychological, embedded in how nations think about security and identity. The past century taught states to fear surprise attack, to fear internal enemies, to fear humiliation. It also taught ordinary people to fear that the world can tilt into catastrophe faster than anyone expects. Violence in the modern age often arrives through asymmetry. Not always tank columns and front lines, but networks, insurgencies, terrorism, and counterterrorism, forms of conflict that blur civilian and combatant, and that can tempt states into overreach. When a government feels threatened, it can slide toward the logic that has fueled so many past atrocities: extraordinary measures, emergency powers, the suspension of rights in the name of survival. History shows how quickly those measures can become permanent. At the same time, the world has never been more interconnected. Information moves instantly. Refugees can be seen on screens in real time. Atrocities can be documented and shared before the smoke clears. That visibility can generate pressure, aid, intervention. It can also generate fatigue, cynicism, and the numbing sense that horror is just another kind of content. This is another inheritance from history's violent centuries: the struggle to keep empathy alive when the scale of suffering becomes overwhelming. And yet, there is a reason to end this journey not in despair, but in clarity. Violence has patterns. It leaves fingerprints. It escalates in recognizable stages. The hardening of identity into ideology, the labeling of groups as threats, the erosion of legal protections, the capture of media, the normalization of cruelty, the formation of armed militias or security forces with impunity, the turning of neighbors against neighbors, the bureaucratic organization of repression. These are warning signs, not mystical, not vague, but concrete. The most violent centuries teach us that prevention is rarely dramatic. It is often quiet work, protecting institutions, strengthening civil society, defending minority rights, maintaining a culture of lawful restraint, building economic resilience so that desperation cannot be so easily weaponized. It is resisting the seduction of simple answers to complex pain. It is refusing to let fear define who deserves to live. If you've traveled through these centuries with me, from famine and plague, through conquest and empire, through revolution and industrial war, through genocide and the long aftershocks of collapsed empires, then you've seen how rarely violence is born from a single cause. It is born from convergence. And that means, importantly, that it can be interrupted by divergence, by choices that pull a society away from the cliff edge. There is no guarantee. History does not promise improvement, but it does offer knowledge. It offers a kind of hard-earned vision. And if you want to keep exploring that vision, through other eras, other hidden catastrophes, other stories of collapse and survival, you're welcome to like this documentary and subscribe. Not as a slogan, and not as a demand, just as a quiet way of staying connected to the long memory, the kind that can make the present a little less blind. Because the ultimate reason to remember history's most violent centuries is not to be haunted by them forever. It is to recognize in our own time the early shadows of the same storms, and to choose, while there is still time, a different weather. Different weather. It's a hopeful phrase, but it can also sound naive, like wishing clouds away with a sentence. History is not moved by wishes. It is moved by incentives, institutions, and the stories people agree to live inside. If there is a different weather available to any society, it is built the way levees are built. Slowly, deliberately, sometimes imperfectly, and always before the flood arrives. The most violent centuries are rarely surprising in hindsight. They feel shocking in the moment, but afterward, their approach looks marked by signals, warnings that were visible, often loudly visible, yet somehow not acted upon with enough force. To understand those signals is not to claim that catastrophe is always predictable. It's to recognize that human beings are often given more notice than they admit. One of the first signals is the way language changes. Listen closely, and you can hear a society preparing itself to harm. The vocabulary of politics becomes biological. Infection, vermin, parasites, cleansing. Or it becomes mechanistic. Enemies as obstacles to remove, populations as problems to solve. The purpose of this language is not mainly to persuade outsiders. It is to anesthetize insiders. It allows ordinary people to imagine that cruelty is not cruelty, but necessity, that killing is not killing, but hygiene. Language also narrows the world into two camps. When leaders insist that only one party, one ethnicity, one faith, one ideology truly belongs, they are not merely making a claim about identity. They are drawing a map that can later be used to decide who deserves protection and who does not. Another signal is the weakening of legal restraint. Violent centuries often begin when the law becomes selective, when courts stop being independent and become instruments, when police gain immunity, when emergency measures are normalized, renewed, quietly expanded. At first, these measures are justified by genuine fears, crime, instability, foreign plots. They promise safety, and safety is persuasive. But the bargain is almost always the same. Trade rights for protection, trade complexity for certainty, trade shared reality for a simpler story. Then there is the signal of organized fear. In stable societies, fear rises and falls with events. In unstable ones, fear becomes a resource. It is manufactured, amplified, harvested. Media, whether state-controlled or captured by factions, plays a role, but so do rumors whispered in lines and markets. Fear is contagious, and unlike disease, it can be aimed. Once fear is aimed, it can be turned into obedience. The most violent centuries also show the danger of humiliation. Humiliation is not merely an emotion, it is a political fuel. Defeat in war, economic collapse, loss of status, these can create a public hunger for restoration. The hunger can be met by honest reform, but it can also be met by scapegoating and revenge. The promise of making us great again, in any era, can become a promise to punish those blamed for decline. In that sense, humiliation is a crossroads. It can lead to rebuilding, or it can lead to cruelty framed as redemption. Economic breakdown is another signal, and perhaps one of the most reliable. When people cannot feed their families, ideologies become less theoretical. In a famine, a slogan can feel like a lifeline. In mass unemployment, a demagogue's certainty can feel like a rope thrown to a drowning person. This is not because the poor are irrational. It is because desperation compresses time. It makes long-term trade-offs feel irrelevant. It makes the future feel like a luxury. And then there is institutional weakness, the brittle state. Some societies endure hardship with less violence because their institutions can absorb shock, because corruption is limited, because public services function, because political competition does not require existential hatred. Other societies are brittle. A disputed election becomes a spark because there is no trusted mechanism to settle it. A drought becomes a famine because there is no infrastructure to distribute food. A protest becomes a massacre because security forces answer to a faction rather than to law. When brittleness meets weapons, the result can be explosive. One of the most unsettling lessons across violent centuries is that violence is not always driven by the fanatical alone. It is often driven by the ambitious, the opportunist, the bureaucrat who prefers career safety over moral risk, the neighbor who settles an old grievance under cover of political chaos, the militia leader who discovers that power feels like a drug. In these moments, violence becomes a marketplace. People trade information for safety. They trade loyalty for food. They trade their conscience for a chance to survive. And because everyone is watching everyone, cruelty becomes contagious. It becomes, in the most frightening way, normal. Yet history also shows points where catastrophe was delayed, diminished, or prevented. That is the other side of the ledger, and it is not empty. In some places, political leaders stepped back from the brink, choosing compromise that made them look weak in the short term but saved lives in the long term. In others, civil society, churches, unions, journalists, teachers, kept communication lines open between communities long enough to preserve trust. There are moments when individuals inside violent systems refuse to comply. A clerk who loses paperwork, a soldier who looks away, a mayor who hides families, a broadcaster who refuses to read a list of names. These are not cinematic heroes with perfect courage. Often they are frightened, compromised, imperfect, but their refusal creates friction in a machine that depends on smooth functioning. Friction matters. It slows killing. It buys time. And time is often the difference between a crisis that burns out and a crisis that becomes a century-defining catastrophe. After violence, the work of rebuilding is not only physical, it is moral. It is the work of deciding what will be remembered, what will be denied, what will be forgiven, and what will be prosecuted. The 20th century, especially, forces the modern world to experiment with justice at scale. Trials establish records. They put names to crimes. They insist, in a courtroom's dry language, that a human being's suffering is not an unfortunate detail, but a fact worthy of judgment. Truth commissions, where they exist, try a different approach. Not always punishment, but the public naming of harm, the recovery of memory from silence. Reparations attempt, always imperfectly, to acknowledge that theft and trauma can echo across generations and still be owed. None of these mechanisms are clean. Justice after mass violence is never clean. Punishment can look like victor's vengeance. Forgiveness can look like forgetting. Memory can be weaponized, but the alternative, silence, has its own cruelty because silence teaches future perpetrators that they may not be held to account. There is also the quiet question that haunts every attempt to measure violent centuries: what gets counted and what disappears. War deaths are counted differently than famine deaths. Executions are counted differently than forced labor deaths. Some archives are meticulous, others are destroyed. Some regimes hide bodies, others hide paperwork. In some places, the dead have names. In others, they are absorbed into the word unknown. The mathematics of ruin is therefore not only arithmetic, it is ethics. It reflects whose lives were recorded, whose suffering was considered worth noting, whose disappearance was treated as normal. That is why history's most violent centuries are not simply those with the largest numbers. They are those that revealed, most starkly, how easily a society can decide that certain people do not count. And here, in the present, we face a new dimension of the old problem: information itself as battlefield. In earlier centuries, propaganda traveled by sermon, pamphlet, rumor. Today it travels at the speed of a swipe. A lie can circle the globe before a correction has finished being written. Algorithms reward outrage. Communities can be isolated inside separate realities. When truth fractures, trust follows. And when trust collapses, violence becomes easier to justify because you can always claim the other side started it. Because you can always find a clip, a quote, a story, whether true or false, that confirms the fear you already feel. This doesn't mean modern technology inevitably produces modern atrocity. It means the struggle for shared reality has become one of the central moral battles of the age. The question is not only what is happening, but what people can be convinced is happening. Add to this the pressures that do not respect borders, pandemics, climate stress, mass migration, and the potential for instability becomes clear. When crops fail or storms intensify, when water becomes scarce, when people move in large numbers seeking safety, political systems can respond with solidarity or with scapegoating. History suggests that the choice is rarely automatic. It is contested. It is shaped by leadership and by the public's willingness to resist the easy comfort of blaming the vulnerable. So if the violent centuries teach us anything practical, it is this: the future is not decided by whether human beings are capable of cruelty. We already know they are. The future is decided by whether societies can build enough restraint, legal, cultural, institutional, to make cruelty costly, unpopular, and difficult to organize. That restraint is not glamorous. It is paperwork with a conscience. It is journalism that refuses to flatter fear. It is education that teaches complexity. It is courts that do not bend. It is a culture that can mourn its own crimes without collapsing into self-hatred, and that can take pride without requiring an enemy. Restraint is the uncelebrated architecture that keeps storms from becoming floods. And when restraint fails, when the architecture cracks, history shows how quickly the weather changes. If you could stand above the last 700 years and watch them move beneath you like a dark river, you would see patterns forming and dissolving. Famine and recovery, war and rebuilding, persecution and uneasy peace. You would also see something more intimate than patterns. You would see faces. A girl in a 14th century village, her cheeks hollow, watching her mother scrape the bottom of an empty pot while rain beats down on fields that won't yield grain. A merchant in Tenochtitlan, stepping through a market that once rang with bargaining voices, now quiet under siege, where the air tastes of smoke and fear. A soldier in the 30 Years' War, not yet 20, coughing in a camp where men die of sickness more often than steal, listening at night to distant screams and wondering when his own turn will come. A man chained in the hold of a slave ship, the ocean rolling above him like fate, the darkness dense with sweat and salt and grief, trying to remember his name as if it were a rope to hold onto. A woman in revolutionary Paris, gripping a loaf of bread like a victory, watching a procession pass and feeling both hope and dread because the crowd can turn in a heartbeat. A peasant in China amid civil war, staring at a field trampled into mud by marching feet, knowing that if he plants, someone may steal the crop, and if he doesn't, his children will starve. A boy in a trench in 1916, holding a letter from home with muddy hands, reading the familiar handwriting like a prayer, then folding it carefully because it might be the last human warmth he ever touches. A family pressed into a cattle car in 1942, the air running out, the baby crying until it doesn't, the parents whispering reassurances they do not believe because belief is the last thing they can offer. A city in 1945, a bright flash, and then the silence that follows when a world is changed in less than a second. A mother in 1947, walking beside a road during partition, her child's hand in hers, her other hand holding a bundle of clothing, her eyes scanning the horizon for danger because danger is everywhere and has her neighbors' faces. A teacher in Cambodia, forced into labor, hiding the fact that he can read because literacy has become a death sentence. A family in Bosnia listening to the radio, hearing the old language of us and them return with a new urgency, realizing with horror that history is not over. A young man in Rwanda at a roadblock, a weapon in his hands, the crowd around him, the radio telling him what to believe, and inside him a war between fear and conscience that will be decided in seconds and will echo for a lifetime. These people are not statistics. They are the reason the statistics matter. When we say history's most violent centuries, we are tempted to stand at a safe distance and speak in totals as if distance protects us from the emotional truth. But distance is part of the danger. Distance is how violence becomes manageable to those who authorize it. Distance is how a policy becomes a death sentence without anyone feeling the weight of a body. The violent centuries teach, again and again, that cruelty thrives when empathy is made inconvenient. They also teach that violence is rarely only one thing. It is rarely only hatred, or only greed, or only ideology. It is often a braid. Hatred provides permission. Greed provides incentive. Ideology provides justification. Fear provides fuel. Bureaucracy provides efficiency. And ordinary life, its routines, its exhaustion, its small compromises, provides the pathway by which extraordinary evil becomes ordinary. This is why the most violent eras are often those in which normal people can continue being normal while horror unfolds nearby. They go to work. They buy bread. They gossip. They complain about taxes. They worry about their children. Meanwhile, down the road, a camp is built. A village is emptied. A list of names is compiled. The challenge for any society is not to imagine itself populated only by heroes. The challenge is to accept that most people, most of the time, will try to survive and belong, and that those instincts can be turned toward kindness or toward cruelty, depending on the stories a society tells and the structures it builds. If there is a single thread that connects the violent centuries, it is the struggle over belonging. Who is us? Who is protected by law? Who is mourned when they die? Who is counted? Who is named? Every era answers those questions differently, but every era answers them. And when the circle of belonging shrinks, violence becomes easier. When the circle expands, restraint becomes possible. This is why memory matters. Not memory as entertainment, not memory as spectacle, but memory as accountability. The dead cannot argue with propaganda. They cannot vote. They cannot testify unless someone preserves their words, their names, their traces. When memory fails, the future becomes vulnerable to the oldest lie. that the victims were not really human, that the suffering was exaggerated, that the cruelty was necessary, that it could not have been otherwise. But memory alone is not enough. History is filled with memorials built beside new battlefields. Remembrance can become ritual rather than restraint. It can be performed without changing anything. The deeper question is what remembrance produces. Does it produce humility, the awareness that your own society is capable of moral failure? Or does it produce self-righteousness, the belief that only others commit atrocities? Self-righteousness is a dangerous kind of innocence because it prevents self-examination. It turns history into a weapon rather than a warning. Humility, on the other hand, is not self-hatred. It is vigilance. It is the willingness to notice when language hardens, when rights erode, when leaders seek power by demanding someone else's disappearance. And there is another lesson that the violent centuries whisper almost quietly beneath the screams. Prevention is often boring. It is not a triumphant cavalry charge. It is budget lines for public health. It is institutions that can deliver food in a drought. It is courts that do not take phone calls from ministers. It is police who fear prosecution if they abuse power. It is journalism that survives intimidation. It is education that teaches people to recognize scapegoating when it appears. It is a culture that can argue fiercely without turning opponents into enemies of existence. These things do not guarantee peace. Nothing does. But they make mass violence harder to organize and harder to justify. Even in the worst centuries, there were people who tried to build these guardrails. After plague came new labor arrangements and the slow rise of new social contracts. After religious wars came diplomatic systems that recognized sovereignty. After world wars came human rights law and international institutions. After genocides came tribunals and conventions. The guardrails are imperfect and sometimes hypocritical, but they represent an ongoing human attempt to say, there are limits. And maybe that is the most honest way to end a journey through the most violent centuries, not with the fantasy of a perfected world, but with the recognition that restraint is an ongoing project. It requires maintenance. It requires courage. It requires citizens who are willing to be unpopular in defense of someone else's humanity. If you've made it to this point, through the darkness and complexity, and you want to keep exploring how the past shapes the moral choices of the present, you can like the documentary and subscribe. Not as a jingle, not as noise, just as a quiet signal that you value history told with care and that you're willing to keep looking directly at what so many prefer to forget. Because in the end, history's most violent centuries are not only records of what happened. They are questions addressed to the living. What will you tolerate? What will you believe? Who will you protect when it is inconvenient? And when the weather begins to change, when fear rises, when language hardens, when the circle of belonging shrinks, will you recognize the first drops of the storm for what they are? The past cannot be rewritten, but the patterns can be recognized. And recognition, if it becomes action, is how the future is kept from becoming another century that the dead will have to explain to the living.